This is the Authority Company Podcast, conversations with leaders that are designing our future. Hola, I'm Joe Pardavila, and my guest today is Paul Perreault, a man who calls himself an accidental CEO, but there's nothing accidental about the wisdom he's about to share. Paul spent a decade leading CSL, a global biotech powerhouse, but his path to the C-suite included some very unexpected turns, starting with seminary school and a job in the burn room. We'll get into that later. In his new book, The Detour CEO, Paul reflects on the moments that shaped his leadership journey, not just the boardroom victories, but the values, setbacks, and serendipitous detours that taught him how to lead with purpose, humility, and heart. Paul, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
I'm doing great, Joe. How are you today?
I'm excellent. Thank you for asking. And so, Paul, one of the things, from reading your book, reading up on you, I feel like we're almost long lost brothers or brothers from another mothers because of this idea that you were able to come up with, and I'm not sure at what point in your life you did, but this separation of work and identity. And so, Paul, as a Gen Xer, I think a lot of us were tied into you are what you do for a living. And I feel like younger generations have done a great job of delineating, difference of like, okay, this is my job and this is who I am. But older generations, I think Gen Xers are probably the last ones, obviously the boomers and greatest generation before that. It was like, hey, what's your name? What do you do? For me, it was my name plus the radio station I worked at. It was like Joe from WPLJ for like 20 something years. That's all I identified myself as. But then I came to a realization that, my radio station got sold off. I was left without a job, and suddenly my identity was not that. And so it was a bit of a struggle, like, who am I? What do I do? And you write about this in your book, but I'm curious, when were you able to make, again, not to age you, Paul, but again, you're not one of these kooky Gen Zs or millennials. You've put in the time. So when did you come to this realization of differentiating who you are and what you do for a living?
Well, look, I guess it started early on, Joe, and I don't know if you're a brother from another mother, but I do got 4 brothers, so another one probably wouldn't, we probably wouldn't notice, but you'd have more hair than all the rest of us. I'd say that the realization really came early on in my life. When I was thinking about what my career might be, where I might go. And in the book, you might have seen that I started off studying for the priesthood in the Benedictine monastery. And, I just couldn't be myself because the church and the whole administration really wanted you to be something that wasn't me. They wanted to mold you into something. And I think that was my first realization that I don't want to be molded. I am who I am. And unfortunately, that's sometimes a good thing, and sometimes, not so good because I'm human. So I have faults, and there's areas that need to improve. But I think that was the first early on. And then as I, started off in another part of my career and started looking at what I'm going to do in the future, not really having a path that I could identify. I just started working hard and just wanted to be the best I could be and use whatever skills I had to make that happen. The titles were not what I was chasing. The ability to, obviously not starve to death was helpful. So, I was trying to make some money and got married early and wanted to, make sure that we had a life together that, wasn't in the back of a car somewhere where we could actually, put down roots and have a family. So it was all about, looking ahead to being who I am, trying to make sure that I didn't get too full of myself. Hubris is not a good thing. My dad was originally a drill instructor on Parris Island in the Marine Corps. So he'd kind of keep you humble, make sure that, you didn't get too big for your britches. So I think part of that was the upbringing as well, and just making sure that you are who you are, you do what you're supposed to do, and good things can happen. So that it was really early, I think. It wasn't like this big moment in my career that I said, oh, there were those moments as well, that brought you back down to earth and said, hey, you're not all that. You need to step it up a bit.
And well, coincidentally, you're the second person in the past year that I've had on podcast that went through seminary school. And the one thing they mentioned was the identity thing. But the also thing, and I'm not sure if you can relate to this, was, for lack of a better word, the fakeness of it. like it seemed like it was more like cosmetic what you were actually doing as opposed to like deep down like doing God's work kind of thing. And maybe that could be just the business of religion where it's like all these it's almost like project management, all these boxes you have to check along the way. That's like, wow, this isn't what I signed up for. This is more like cold than I thought it was going to be.
Well, that's the thing, I mean, I was there for a particular reason, and it wasn't about, getting up, put on a pedestal in front of a congregation. It was to serve. And, I ended up serving some people during the week, and then I got yelled at for missing daily mass. And I'm like, well, this doesn't make any sense. That is cosmetic. I mean, we're here to serve. So, sorry I missed mass on a Thursday, but too bad. So they didn't quite like that answer either, but
I bet, yes. I'm sure that you probably got a timeout for that. All right, so your book's fascinating. You like I said, you mentioned this journey you went on to starting potentially being a priest and then moving into the corporate world. And one of the early parts of the book that jumped out at me was the burn room. Tell us about the burn room.
Well, I was starving and living with my brother and sister-in-law, and they were kind enough to take me in when I left the seminary and came back down to Florida from Southern Indiana. So I was hunting for a job, doing job interviews. So I went to a temp agency, and the temp agency had this opening, not unsurprisingly, for the burn ring. And back in the day, I mean, you had a lot of cardboard cartons that had wax on them that held the milk, and that's how they sealed it hermetically on the top of the carton. And there was a big heater that ran across there, and sometimes it would get stuck, and the carton would kind of catch on fire and burn, or burn itself, and then the milk would burn. It'd be bad, and so it went down the other path on the kind of like going through TSA when your bag gets pushed to the other side,
Right.
and so it was one of those things where it would end up in this big vat in this room, and it smelled like high heaven, because it was just like burnt milk, and my job was to clean out the vats, and it was ridiculously horrible, because you go home at the end of the day and you just smelled like burnt milk, and rotten milk, and it was not a good thing. So you strip down in the garage before you even went into the house because you didn't want to bring that stuff in. Luckily, the washer and dryer were in the garage, so that also helped.
So tell me, you describe a pretty horrific scene. What do you take away from that? Like, what do you learn from that other than I don't want to work? I don't want to work in the dairy industry for the rest of my life. Like, what was something that you took away from that time other than like the obvious? Like, I ain't doing this again.
Well, I got a call back after 2 weeks from the temp agency, and the dairy said they wanted to hire me full time. And I'm like, well, I don't know what I'd be doing, but if I'm stuck in the burn room, I don't want to do that full time. But, it just told me that, I could put up with a lot of stuff, and I could, do the job that was expected of me in a good way, in such a way that I was adding value, obviously, they probably had a lot of turnover in that burn room, would be my guess.
I bet.
Looking back on it, I'm sure there was. But I stuck it out for the time they hired me, and then they wanted to hire me full time. So, what I learned was, you'll run into some things during your career that, may not be the best opportunity. And it turned out I didn't want to stay there, so I went on to other things. So it taught me, what do I want to do and what I don't want to do. It also taught me that hard work will get you noticed, and you can add value, and no matter what you're doing.
That's great. And that sort of leads to my next question in terms of, we talked about you working in organized religion in this really shoddy dairy and part of the dairy industry, but then you get into the corporate world and you write about the idea of being a generalist, being, uh, able to, one thing of the way I call it is like jack of all trades, being able to be dangerous and, know enough to be dangerous in a certain field. Was it early on when you realized how being a generalist you were able to then pick and choose what you want to do for the rest of your life?
Well, look, when I was so just briefly back to the seminary, they didn't have sciences or business courses to take, and it was a college seminary. And so I have a minor in philosophy, a minor in religion, a minor in history, and a degree in psychology because that was, what the offerings really were. And that generalist liberal arts background, I think, also helped me think differently. It helped me kind of get my mind organized around different areas of study, number one. And then number two, I said to myself, well, psychology, if, I'm going to be ending up working with people no matter what I do. So it can't hurt, right, to have that. So I'll pick that as the major. And then when I got out, that was the fastest way for me to get my degree. So I stuck with psychology before I went into business. But, I would say that the generalist in me helped a lot growing up as well, just because, with seven siblings, there's a lot to do around the house. And, my dad would always have a 5-minute job, which turned into 3 days. So it was, one of those things where, you learned a lot on the job. And I think that being a generalist, I could see how things interconnected across different jobs and across life, really. And so that generalist approach of learning a little about a lot of stuff really helped me to understand how business worked, because I was interested in finance, I was interested in sales, I was interested in marketing, I was interested in operations. And that generalist approach as a leader of an organization helped me in my ability to connect dots across the organization when decisions had to be made. So how would this decision on this side affect the other people on this side of the business, and vice versa? And what needed to happen across the business to make that happen? Harvard Business Review wrote an article years ago about failures of CEOs and why they, lasted a couple of years, and then there was a lot of turnover. So this was back in the 2000s, a lot of turnover in the C-suite. And they boiled it down to one of the key items of being really domain experts growing up in a business. So they started off as an accountant in the business, and then ended up being a CFO and then the CEO. But their whole life was finance. The same with scientists, especially in the biotech medical industry that I was in. A lot of founder scientists that had always been in the labs, and then they discovered a product and started a company, and they became CEO of the company. Well, it's interesting that not everybody always has your best interest in mind when you're sitting in the C-suite. So if you don't understand how other things kind of interact and work, you're dependent on your domain experts, which you need, by the way, to make sure that you're going down the right path. But sometimes if the CEO doesn't ask the right questions, if they don't really understand those things, they could get the wrong information. And usually that could be by happenstance, but sometimes it's because somebody wants your job too. So it's one of those things where, uh, that generalist in me growing up in the business, not being born a CEO, allowed me to really understand the complexities of an organization, just like the complexities of a large family, just like the complexities of, big institutions, just like the complexity that you have to navigate through life in general. It's a journey that we're on. It's a great journey, but it helps to understand how it's progressing, and that's that generalist in me. Like I think domain experts are absolutely necessary. We need domain expertise, and everybody today talks about specialize. But I think general management and generalist is a bit of a lost art these days. They call general management for a reason, you know, and a lot of it has to do with people, because, Seinfeld said, people, they're the worst. But, I don't think that's the case. I think people are great. It's just you got to have people, but you also need to know how to manage people, how to lead people, how to motivate people, how to assist people in their careers. So it's all of that that brought that generalist sense to me.
All right, so you're equipped with all this knowledge, everything from seminary to dairy to you go to college and everything like that. But then you have to actually choose a lane. And
Yeah.
so when did you decide to go into a certain industry or anything like that? When did that happen in your life where you're like, okay, I have all the skills, but when you work for a certain company, they're going to have a specific sort of industry that they're involved with. So how did you end up in yours?
Look, Joe, I didn't know, what I wanted to do, to be honest with you. I was just working 80 hours a week managing a restaurant in Orlando, Florida. And I just got married, and, I had Sundays off. That was it. And I was in at 7 and out at 2 a.m. every night. And it wasn't conducive to a new married, relationship. And I had all these people calling on me, selling me stuff because I also did all the buying for the restaurant. And I never saw anybody before 9, and I didn't see anybody after 5. And they had nicer cars than I had and seemed to, have a pretty good life. And I said, maybe I should start selling stuff. So I started looking into sales because at the restaurant we were selling every day. It was a high-end restaurant. It was one of the top 10 restaurants in Florida at the time. And it was it was one of those things where I said, I have an ability probably to talk to people. I have these people calling on me. I see what they're doing. And I had a lot of offers for different things. But I went to pharmaceuticals. One, my dad had been in pharmaceutical sales. So I kind of knew that what happened in the business from the inside out a little bit. Not having worked directly for him or with him at that time. Um, but it was also about trying to do good. My grandfather was a physician, and he was a great diagnostician, and he knew that there was more to medicine than just science. They used to call it the art of medicine for a reason. There's a lot of art still left in medicine. We still, as smart as we are, don't know everything about these vessels that we occupy. So it's one of those things where I said, if I can't do good serving, you know, the church, maybe I'll think about serving patients and, making sure that the medical community, because I had an interest in medicine anyway, and just from my background and growing up. So I was like, okay, I'll try pharmaceutical sales. So I interviewed, I don't know, probably 6, 7 times, got rejected every time because I didn't have, quote, the right sales experience. And then
Right.
finally somebody took a chance on me and I got the job and started as a sales rep, loved it, and thought I'd retire a sales rep. No idea I'd end up where I ended up. So, this path of writing the book, and one of the reasons that I wrote the Detour CEO was really to think about the story of how I ended up where I ended up, which I never expected in my life, and to be put in charge of anything, and neither did my mom probably. But it's just one of those things where you look and you see and you keep working hard and people see things in you that you don't see in yourself. So I'd like to tell you there was a grand plan of why I chose a career and how it happened, but it was more happenstance, just thinking through my, where do I want to add value? Because some of the other sales jobs I interviewed for were, Oscar Mayer or, Dr. Pepper, or because I was in the food industry, right? So more paper company, which at the time you needed a big warehouse to store all your paper forms. And it was the early 80s. So computers were just coming out. And I'm like, I'm not sure I want to sell, you know, receipt pads to gas stations and, all the stuff that you have to do at the time. So important stuff, got to have the receipts, but that's not what I wanted to do. So I wanted something that I felt I could really sink my teeth into and add value to.
That's great. And you glibly write in the book about how you were the accidental CEO. But at one point, Paul, you probably were, climbing this proverbial ladder, and we'll get into ladders in a minute. But like at one point, you're like, huh, you know what? I could probably run this place, or I could run a place. Because you have to have that confidence. I always feel like everyone has that inner ego in them. Like whether you're an actor, you have to have the ego to say, "Oh, I want to be projected on a 50-foot screen," or if you're an entrepreneur, "Oh, I want to change the world." So there's a little bit of ego in all of us to a certain extent. Some people handle it better than others. We all know about that. But when did you come to the realization during this journey where you're like, "Oh yeah, I have what it takes to be a leader of a large corporation"?
It was probably, I would say around the mid 90s. So, I'd been working, a long time. So I already at that point, probably 15, 17 years actually, and just in the pharma industry. And I saw people above me who I'd liked a lot, but there were certain gaps that, I was leading a business unit at the time for a large pharma company, and I had hundreds of people in that business unit, and they seemed to be responding to my style and my leadership, that I had, and the management piece of what I was doing, and my ability to try to help others be successful. Because it's not about me all the time, or it shouldn't be anyway. But you're right. There is a confidence and an ego that we all have. And I would look above and say, and I told one of the folks in the company before I moved to a new company, I said, if we could just figure out the people side of the business, we'd be unstoppable. Our pipeline is great. The research is great. We have the reach, the scale, but the people side, we're missing the people side, and we need people. And so I felt like I had an ability to lead the organization. I knew enough about how it ran. I knew enough about, where I could add value. And one of the things was really that leadership journey and the strategic value that, hopefully I could bring to the party. Because, there's a lot of books written about strategy. There's a lot of books written about leadership, but very few written about how strategy and leadership come together. And so I think that's a bit of what I've tried to put through in the book besides my story. But it was probably the mid-90s when I first said to myself, you know what, if I ever run a company or get to a place, I hope I can remember these things and not be, too full of myself.
No, it's great. It's so funny. It reminds me, my wife and I both worked in radio for years, and we would often have to work with other people, whether it's in other industries, whether it's in marketing, whether programming. And my wife and I used to have this running joke of like, there'll always be a job for me. Like when you'd have an interaction with someone who's like a VP or a president, you're like, oh God, if this person can do that, they'll always be. It sounds like I'm not putting words in your mouth, but I almost feel like that was your perspective too. Is like you had the people skills, you knew what you, as you mentioned, the gaps, and then there are probably people around you or above you. You're like, I could do a better job than this person. I'm sure some of that came up, right, Paul?
Yeah, there was some of that. I have to say, because there were some bosses I had that I was like, I don't want to be like that, and that's not the way I want to act or be. And hopefully, I can be who I am, like going back to our initial part of the conversation, and still be successful in running a big company, not having to be, as one guy that saw my golf swing said that was a CEO swing. And I said, what's that? He says, a little jerk at the top. So I'm like, that's I said, that's not what I wanted to be, right? Was that little jerk at the top. So it was, there was that time. And I think that everybody kind of says that from time to time, but nobody wants to really, keep going on that path because look, it's not easy. It's a hard job. There's no doubt. There's a lot of hard jobs. This one is more mentally taxing probably than other things.
Yeah, and I referenced the ladder, and you write about that. There's no such thing as a corporate ladder; it's more of a labyrinth.
Yeah.
Tell me about that because I feel like, especially now, you're almost very future thinking too, Paul. Because I think again, going back to younger generations, there is not this, get a job out of college, work there for 40 years, retire and drop dead. Like that is older mentality. Now these younger people are like, yeah, I think I'll do this job for a couple of years and then I'll move over here. It doesn't have to be a upward movement. It could be lateral. It's just because people are prioritizing their mental health. So tell me about this labyrinth and why it's not just this, straight line as we once were told it was.
Well, Joe, ladders are dangerous. A lot of accidents happen on ladders.
Right.
So, I always tell people at the house, I said, try to stay off the ladders. Because you slip one wrong and all of a sudden you're down at the bottom with a, broken leg or a broken neck or something. And so, thinking about this ladder, and the fact to me that there wasn't a direct path to the roof, it's not like, you could just get the longest ladder you possibly can. And then each rung is a step and there's a process for each step. I mean, you're going, I didn't even know I was climbing, to be honest with you. And that's why the labyrinth was there because I took on different roles that people offered me because I thought they were interesting. I thought I could learn more. And when I looked at how things were progressing, I didn't even know I was up for the job, to be honest with you. So that's how clueless I was. I was just, had my head down working hard. I mean, I'd grown to be the president of the largest division for CSL. So it was 90% of the company at the time. And even then, when I got that job, everybody was talking about how I was going to get the job, but nobody had talked to me yet. So it was like, okay, great. So when it finally happened, I was like, okay, that's interesting, but I'd, had done I guess a good enough job where they said, hey, this guy's got some stuff. As one of my good friends said one time, you're deceptively smart. So I wasn't quite sure if that was a compliment, but I guess it is.
Right.
So it was one of those things where I think this labyrinth is, you have to understand how organizations work. You have to understand where you can add value. You have to understand where, the company is going from a strategic standpoint, and can you add to the value of the strategy? Can you be the exemplary leader? Can you be that person that, people listen to, even if you're not in the position of highest authority? You can tell around a conference room when you're in a meeting, when somebody speaks and all of a sudden everybody stops to listen. And they may not be the person running the meeting, but that person has somehow garnered a respect and an intellect and a knowledge that other people value. And so that labyrinth, and that person may not even understand it, right? You might have a very loud voice who everybody just shuts down when they start talking because they try to dominate the conversation in the room. And that's another part of the labyrinth, because they may manage up really well, right? And then they get to that position and all of a sudden they're moving again because they get fired, or they don't get the job as CEO, and then they're disheartened, so they leave, which happens in companies where companies pit, candidates up against each other, and then they know they're going to lose one probably, but why would you do that if they're both great candidates? So you have to talk to people and understand how that labyrinth is going to work, because you want to keep all the good people you can. And you want to make sure that people understand what their role is and where their value's added and where that is. And that's a very windy road. And you make mistakes, and then you're like, oh, my career is over. And then somebody says, well, you know what? It's not. It wasn't a fatal mistake. Most mistakes aren't. So, it's business at the end of the day, and, you try to recover from it. I mean, there are things that happen that are very difficult to deal with, but, you get on with it, and you move on with it. You don't wallow in it and think about, oh, I could have done this if this hadn't happened, or if this person didn't say that. And that's part of the labyrinth. I mean, labyrinth is a big place, right? So it's there's a lot of these movements that happen. And so in the younger generation, how they move from job to job is interesting. I think, they're typically moving within, again, their expertise. So if they want to move and they want to do things differently, I'd suggest they learn as much as they can about a lot of things, because AI is a big topic right now, and people are like, oh, this is going to get rid of humans, and, it's going to take a lot of jobs. Well, have the ability to learn and learn a new skill. Somebody has to still manage all that AI stuff, right? So,
Yeah.
you know, it's like we used to put little pins into the telephone, right, with operators, and
Oh, yes.
yeah, you don't remember that. You're way
I was
too.
thinking, I saw that in a movie once, Paul. But yeah,
Yeah,
continue.
right.
Yes.
Yeah, from the 40s,
Right.
1940s. But that people had to relearn. So the ability to relearn skills and learn other things is always important, which is why that generalist thing came back to me, really, when I was in business. I'm like, how much can I learn about this part of the business, this part because I knew a lot, but I don't know everything. Nobody does.
Yeah, it's great. All right, I don't want to turn this into like a CEO pity party or play the world's smallest violin, but CEOs are, Paul, literally under fire these days. I mean, we've seen the headlines. I mean, as we're recording this, there's an incredibly viral moment about a tech CEO. There's been ad nauseum things written about CEOs' salaries. When funny enough, I always talk about this. When I was a kid, you didn't know CEOs' names. Like,
No.
it maybe you knew like Jack Welch from GE because GE was like the biggest company in the planet. You might know that name.
Yeah.
But now people know the names of CEOs of companies where that was never a thing. Obviously, media has to do with that. Social media has to do with that. But tell me about this CEO kind of backlash where, I mean, and I've seen a lot of CEOs talk about this. It's the loneliest job in the world. Again, I don't want to turn this into a CEO pity party, but tell me about that idea of these CEOs under, like, they were always under a microscope. And I think now that microscope has been ratcheted up to like levels where you're seeing like the DNA.
Yeah.
Tell me about this sort of world that we're living in, and the sort of like the tenuousness of being a CEO.
Well, look, you're under so much scrutiny all the time. I mean, when I was CEO at CSL, at one point, we were the largest company by market cap on the Australian Stock Exchange. So anytime any day there'd be an article about CSL or about me or about, something I said or something I, was presenting or something the company was happening or the share price dropped $2 or, whatever it was. I mean, there was always something. So the scrutiny was amazing. You're under the microscope all the time because you're right. There's a lot more notoriety, but it's also interesting that being one of the largest companies in the world, um, a lot of people didn't know my name and they didn't know CSL because it was listed on the Australian Stock Exchange. So I had a little bit of a help there. I like to say we're the biggest company nobody's ever heard of. So it was, one of those things where we were sheltered a little bit, but in certain markets, I mean, it was massive and it was constant. And it was about, pay and it was about, culture and all the rest of it. But I would just say that what I see is people, again, just losing their way from who they are, or maybe that's who they are. And so when people get in trouble and everybody knows their name, uh, they act differently, right? And so they try to hide things that they don't want people to know, or what is it. But if you're living the life that, you expect to live and you're adhering to your own values and trying to build a culture of a company, look, I can tell you, I made lots of mistakes. And, I got some notoriety for that, not the way that the current, thing happened over the last
Right,
week.
right, right.
But I would just say that, those things, just again point out that you have to be, if you're trying to build a culture of a company, you better live the culture yourself. Because if you don't, nobody's going to believe you, number one. You'll be found out and it'll come out because it's instantaneous today. News is everywhere all the time at a moment's notice. And so the scrutiny is there. The other thing is shareholder value, right? I mean, everybody talks about shareholder value and the fact that, and what they mean is what's your share price, right? So are we making money? Um, and for me, it was about, again, value proposition. The only reason we exist in the pharma biotech industry is to take care of patients. Without that, we don't exist. So keep that as the forefront. And even though we had a lot of social stuff going on, I didn't comment on social issues unless it directly affected what we do as a company, right? I mean, the people in the company, sure, there's social issues going on with them, and they'll do what they need to do in their private lives. But when you come to work to take care of patients, and that's what we had to do every day, we had to work every day like a patient's life depended on it because it did. These were rare diseases. They were life-saving, life-extending, non-discretionary medicines that patients needed. So I just kept that in mind, and the share price to me is a scoreboard. It's not the game plan. And so I had to tell shareholders many times, we're not going to hit your expectations this quarter or this half because you know what, we're reinvesting in the company because we need the growth and we continue to grow as an organization. And I think there's some stories in the book about that as well, meeting with investors and talking about, what's the real value that we're adding here is the strategy for growth, not, the share price, which, if you do everything the way you're supposed to, hopefully the share price will be reflected. People see the value, they'll buy your stock. And that's what it's about.
Yeah, it's funny, Paul. If we were doing a drinking game about if do a shot every time Paul says the word value or add value, we'd
Yeah.
probably be inebriated right now. And you write about the phrase
So
add
you want me to,
value.
change topics? Is that it? Or?
No, 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 no. I'm leading to a question here. Paul, I'm a professional. I'm going somewhere here.
Okay.
So tell me if for someone listening or watching this and they're like, okay, I keep hearing Paul talk about adding value, adding value. What do you tell someone when they have that question? Like, all right, Paul, I want to be successful in the field. I want to add value. How do I add value? What are some tips, tricks that you could tell people when it comes to being able to add value to a team, to a company, to a culture?
So there's so many things, Joe, but I would just say that in every job, it doesn't matter what you're doing, whether you're sitting in the accounting department or whether you're the chief scientist, where you think, value. Every day, when I hear people come home and they go, boy, I hate my job. I'm like, okay, well, number one, find something else to do. Life's too short to do all this every day and you hate it. I said, that's ridiculous. So is there anything about the job you do like? Well, I like this or I like that. Okay, so are you adding value there? Meaning, Are you asking the right questions of the people above you and bringing them, really ideas that could change what you don't like about it? That's value add, right? If you're sitting in a management position, how are you adding value for the people that work for you? Or is it just about you getting to the next level? And so you're just beating the crap out of the people that, are reporting to you. I mean, that's unhelpful, right? Because you're not building a culture, you're not building leadership. People aren't going to go through a wall for you if they see you treating people differently because they're your friend or you're not holding them to the same standards. So make sure that you're consistent in everything you do with the people that you're working with. And then listen. Listening is a skill. You can't talk and listen at the same time. So let other people have the floor. That adds value because when people talk about diversity and they talk about, all the different, genders and races, diversity of thought is what really gets companies going. And sometimes that comes from the other parts of diversity and sometimes it doesn't. But it comes from diversity of thinking and acting and behaving and interacting. Those are the things that make a difference in an organization. And those are the things that people should think about when they're sitting in a meeting. Are they just, sitting on Zoom, going and checking on the laundry in between and putting themselves, taking off video and put themselves on mute? Or are they actually engaged in what they're doing? So engagement is key, and engaging in different ways with people in different aspects of how you make the company culturally move forward. And anybody can help to do that. Now you have to be in the right company that, allows that culture. And if you feel like that's not for you, then I would suggest, trying to find something else. For whether if you're early in your career or even mid-career, you don't want to keep working and feel like you're frustrated because you're not getting there. And believe me, I know that people say, well, it's hard, there's not enough jobs. There's always something to do. And if you're that good, you can be an entrepreneur and start your own. If you know where value can be added and it's missing in the companies you're working with, consultants make a lot of money, and they can go out and then consult in those areas if you have some of these answers and some of these things that you can help with. So there's always places to add value. And I think that that's really what I'm saying to people is, it doesn't have to be value at the C-suite. It can be value, with what's going on and cleaning the offices, because that was a big thing during COVID, right? So, everybody had to, make sure everything was wiped down and clean and, all the rest of the things that happened. But, without people actually doing the work, there was no value to be added. So there's just so many things, culturally, personally, and that you can do as well as in your job specifically. Technically, there's value to be added. I mean, we didn't get to the science level we are today by still, taking 3 months to sequence a gene. I mean, kids can sequence a gene in high school these days with some of the, they used to be a career effort, right? So there's been a lot of value added along the way to get us to where we are, but there's still more value to come.
That's awesome. Good stuff. Paul, I always wrap up these conversations taking folks behind the dedication of the book, and you dedicate your book to Beverly, Christine, and Paul. Thank you all for your love, support, patience through the detours. Tell us why it was important. Obviously, this is your fam. Tell us why it was important to dedicate the book to them.
Look, because at the end of the day, that's who I have, right? I mean, the company is the company. The people that are in my life are still the people in my life, and that's where it is. Uh, I was kind of really impressed this weekend with Scotty Scheffler, right? And some of the comments that he made about, you know, it's not about the win, it's about my life and what's happened and how it's been created. And I'm fortunate, but it's a celebration that lasts a moment. But I'm always back to a celebration of my family and who I'm with. And so it's the same. It's about family, it's about friends, it's about, adding value to them as well. There I go again with the adding value. But that's really where it's at. And so, Paul, Christine, and Bev had a lot to put up with. And I thank them for that.
Awesome. His name is Paul Perreault. The book, The Detour CEO, 9 Unexpected Turns on the Road to Leadership Success. Paul, thanks so much for the time. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Joe. Appreciate it.
And that's going to do it for this episode. If you want to find out more information about Paul and our other amazing authors, go to theauthoritycompany.com.